The controversial battle over transgender rights for minors in Alberta is in the news again. And joining us from Edmonton to chat about this and more is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, this has to do with the Alberta government's legislation that restrict hormone therapy, right, as well as the gender reassignment surgery for minors under the age of 16, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so what has happened is when that bill became law, which was a couple months ago now, um, it obviously got challenged in court. I don't think anyone was surprised by that
Right.
news that this sort of thing would be challenged in court. And so what has happened is a judge has issued an injunction, which basically means that those rules will not be in effect until the court finally makes a decision on the constitutionality of this legislation, of this change, of these healthcare rules that are in effect. So it's not limbo per se, but it sort of is because we don't know what that outcome might be. The court might find that this is constitutional and the rules that the legislature passed will come back into effect. They could find it unconstitutional, and then it would, be incumbent upon the provincial government to decide what to do next. So basically, we've reverted though to the law as it was, say, this time last year around these procedures. And that's going to remain the case as the parties battle this one out in court.
Yeah, so somebody was lined up to get, you know, reassignment surgery or, puberty blockers, that sort of thing. They will legally be allowed to do so. That is what it is. And again, I wonder, how long it will take to figure all this out in the court system. And it certainly does bring up the question, right? Will Alberta, should they lose, I guess, in the courts, will they invoke the notwithstanding clause? And
Mhm.
I'm guessing they probably would, I think. I mean, there seems to be pretty strong support, I think, from what I've seen in the surveys here in Alberta from the public saying, yeah, that makes sense. Should 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, whatever, make these life-changing decisions to have, sex assignment research, so reassignment surgery or hormone blockers, when we're seeing some of the reports coming from other nations around the world, in Europe, for example, like the UK and so forth, where we're seeing kind of, some health problems that are coming up on the radar saying, this, is not something we should be experimenting with, especially with younger kids.
Yeah, so I think that you raise a good question with the notwithstanding clause, and it is true that public support for these measures has been relatively high. It's funny because the notwithstanding clause itself tends to be very controversial. I think it was only ever used twice by Ralph Klein's government, and I think in the second instance they backed off relatively quickly, sort of in the face of a bit of a backlash from the public. I don't know if you'd see that this time for a couple of reasons. The first being this specific issue, which, as you point out, has relatively high levels of public support. But also, I think the culture around the notwithstanding clause has changed a little bit. Quebec has used it a bunch. Saskatchewan used it in similar circumstances last year. So it could be something that they go ahead with. And I think the Premier Daniel Smith has said that it's sort of it's an option on the table. So to some extent, I think there may be floating this as an idea, preparing the public a little bit maybe for the
Yeah.
idea that they might use the notwithstanding clause. They're not going to do it yet, though. They do still think they can win this one in court, so they're going to
Hmm.
battle it out. And also, part of the trouble with using the notwithstanding clause, especially early in the process, is you're basically admitting that your legislation is unconstitutional. You're saying
Right.
this is unconstitutional, but we're going to do
Yeah.
it anyways, which is not like a great rhetorical position to be in, especially at the beginning of the process. If you lose in the end and you say, this is a matter of such weighty public concern that we're going to do it, it's a little bit different of an argument to make, a little bit different of a sales pitch to make to the public, I think. So it's still very much in play, but I don't think we're going to see it invoked until a fair bit later in
Yeah,
this
yeah, that makes
process.
sense. And I think it's a 5-year renewable thing, right? So the last 5 years, and if they want to renew it, I guess they can renew it, whoever the government is at that time. So, okay. Some Alberta separation news. This is kind of interesting. A group of pro-Canada activists, they kind of scooped the separatists on this one. Can you explain what's actually taken place?
Sure, yeah. So there's this group, and I believe Thomas Lukaszek, who used to be a big sort of progressive conservative party bigwig, is involved in this. And they basically went to Elections Alberta to get a referendum question crafted, and there's still a whole process to go before this ends up on the ballot. But basically, they put in their question and said, "Do you agree that Alberta should remain part of Canada?" That's it. That's their question. No waffling about
So
it.
they flip-flopped, it was not
They,
flip-flop, but it's the opposite
it's
approach,
the
right?
exactly. It's the total inverse of what the separatists might want. But here's the catch: there cannot be dueling referendums happening at the same time. So there cannot be two referendums on secession happening at the same time. So this means that question that the pro Canada people have come up with, if it gets to the point of a referendum, that's going to be the question that everyone's voting on. There is not at this point going to be a question from the separatist side. So
Well,
as you
that
sort of
is
point,
if they get this in place on time, right?
yeah, if they get the signatures, if they get it in, if it goes through the whole sort of rigmarole to get it onto the ballot. But the reason this is a little bit funny is it was not that long ago, maybe a month ago, that a group of separatists, I think it was the Alberta Prosperity Project folks, put out their own question. They said, "This is the question we want to ask of Albertans. We're gathering signatures, so on and so forth." But the pro Canada guys just beat them to the official Elections Alberta paperwork side of things. So a bit of a, take the air out of the sails a bit of the separatists here in the province. They're not going to go down without a fight. I'm sure they'll continue to do their thing. But if we see a ballot question in the next year, it'll probably be the one from the pro Canada people.
Yeah, now, do they have enough signatures to get this in place? And they've put the paperwork in before folks like the Alberta Prosperity Project, but do they actually have the signatures? Apparently, Alberta Prosperity Project does have the signatures ready to go. So if they don't have the signatures ready to go, could they still reverse scoop them, I guess, if you will?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I actually don't know for sure. The information that's been out there on it has not been super clear on that point because they do still need to gather more signatures. So they might have just front loaded the process as opposed to rear loaded the process, if that makes sense. In other words, they might be getting the signatures after the fact, after they've registered this sort of question. But it's interesting. I think there's been some, if we back up a month and a half, everyone was talking about this, right? This was going to be the big issue that was going to define maybe the next 6 months of Alberta politics. There was talk of there maybe being a referendum even on the municipal ballot in October. Um, and then things seemed to sort of die down. I almost said Jason Kenney, not Jason Kenney. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Mark Carney seemed to be getting along a little bit. There was some talk of projects getting done. And then, of course, there were the by-election losses for the Alberta Republican Party. And so a new Independence Party. So it sort of died down a little bit. But now we see these developments, you think, well, we might actually have to have this conversation because the pro Canada people might be forcing it as well. So it does strike me as something that isn't going to go away. And you raise the point, a really good point, of the Alberta Prosperity Project signatures. If they've reached that threshold of 180,000 people or whatever it might be, that's a lot of people that want to talk about this. And the government certainly might not want to, and the pro Canada people probably don't want to, but we're looking at a good chunk of people. I mean, we're looking at the population of Red Deer basically are saying we should have a conversation about this. So I don't think this is going away anytime soon, and it's happening in a more unavoidable way because it's official. The last time we had this sort of thing in 2018, 2019, we had lots of protests. We had the original convoy on Ottawa, but this never got to the point of a referendum or anything like that. Once this sort of, I think, bakes in the conversation in a little bit in a way that we haven't experienced in quite a long time, maybe ever.
In Alberta, launching the Alberta Next panel, right? So kind of similar to the Ralph Klein former Fair Deal panel. Do you want to unpack that one a bit for us?
Sure, yeah. So Alberta loves its panels.
We
I don't know
do.
if it's just I don't know if it's just a United Conservative government thing, but man, we do seem to have a lot of panels. So we're doing it again. As you alluded to, Ralph Klein did this back in like 2003, 2004 after the firewall letter was released. Jason Kenney did this in 2018, 19, 20, around then with the Fair Deal panel. And we're doing it again. And this is the Alberta Next panel. So this was sort of floated prior to the federal election when Danielle Smith said, I might convene another panel to see what Albertans want to do if the Liberals win again. Of course, the Liberals won again, so now we're having another panel, and it's going to tackle, a bunch of the same questions. Do we want an Alberta provincial police force? Do we want an Alberta pension plan, leaving the Canada pension plan? Those are old issues, settled issues to some extent, but who knows? Maybe people's views have shifted on them over the last couple of years. So we'll be talking about that. There's also some newer stuff, a little bit more stuff on immigration and controls. That the UCP has also been floating this idea that Alberta should have sort of final say on who is settling in the province, and then if people come here without the approval of the Alberta government, they might not get access to social services, for example. There's some talk about what are maybe some of the constitutional reforms that Alberta could push for. Of course, highly unlikely in that situation, just because it's such a complicated process to amend the Constitution. A little bit of stuff on tax collection. So it's not all super sexy and super fun. I mean, I don't know if anyone gets all that
But
excited
I
about.
mean, again, that could be wise. I mean, Quebec does that, collects their own taxes. You give you some leverage with the federal government, right?
Yeah, yeah, and so it's exploring, as you say, some of these things that Quebec did before, already does. Depend whether or not those are good ideas is a little bit maybe in the eye of the beholder. But certainly we're going to be talking about it. And Danielle Smith is chairing the panel. Got a bunch of pretty smart people on it. They'll be doing the tour of the province thing, get feedback kind of thing, and have a report at the end of the day. So we'll see where it goes. We'll see if they land on any definite conclusions about any of this, and then of course we'll see what that means. Of course we had the Fair Deal panel, and has anything changed since 2020? Has anything changed for the better since 2020? Has anything changed for the worst? So I guess we'll see what comes of that, what concrete options come out of that panel, and whether or not this government, because they'll be going into an election in 2027. So do they want to spend the year prior to that sort of talking about this stuff? I think there's a lot of big questions here. But the other thing I would just add on this is, and Jason Kenney did the same thing with the Fair Deal panel, is this is also a way to release some of that pressure, some of that sort of separatist, angry pressure that's building up. Release the pressure a bit, channel it into something maybe arguably a little more productive. So I think that's maybe a sort of a second motivation here for what the government's doing.
Yeah, again, I think that does make sense. And Alberta also launching a new task force to tackle aggression in classrooms. Now, apparently both from parents and students.
Yeah, this is one of those things that teachers have sort of been telling the Alberta Teachers Association, the teachers union, about for quite some time, and they've been calling on the government to do something. And it's sort of two separate but similar issues. You've got complexity, as in more children with complex needs in classrooms, and that often translates into requests for more sort of teacher assistance in the classroom, more staffing, more as teaching assistants, that kind of thing. And then there's the aggression part of it, which is obviously linked to some extent, but the teachers do say they're seeing more of it. And so this task force, they basically have the summer while school's out to convene the panel. The members are going to be announced in a couple weeks here, over the next couple weeks, I should say. And they'll come back with recommendations, sort of short, medium, long-term recommendations in the fall. And the province, by the sounds of it, looking to implement some of those relatively quickly, like maybe as soon as the 2025-2026 school years, which is obviously the school year
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
up.
yeah.
So it could be some significant sort of classroom moves, I think, in the next school year, depending on how this all comes together.
Well, yeah, we don't want aggression in the schoolrooms. Sorry, yeah. So let's do something about it. Okay, good, good. Alberta by-election federally has been called for Battle River Crowfoot. August 18th, I think, is the date. This is that riding that MP Damien Kirk resigned his seat for Pierre Poilievre to run in. Now, this is a pretty safe riding, right? I mean, he won by like a huge margin, right?
I mean, it would be the upset of the century if Pierre Poilievre was to lose again and lose in one of the most conservative ridings in the country. I think that's practically impossible. And we talked about this on the show a couple weeks ago. This is not a massive Alberta story, but I do think it's kind of interesting that we will now have a leader of the opposition representing an Alberta riding. That hasn't happened since Stephen Harper was prime minister, probably was the last time you had a party leader from the province or representing an area of the province. So significant just in that regard. There might be a little more attention paid to Alberta issues, although I think a lot of Albertans would say already that Pierre Poilievre pays a lot of attention to the issues out here.
Right.
And the thing I'd mentioned a couple weeks ago was that I also think it'll be interesting for the people of that riding. How much a good chunk of what MPs do is deal with local concerns, sort of vis-a-vis the federal government. Like, I need a visa for this, or my
Yeah.
benefits haven't come through for this. Can you help me out? Curious to see how successfully Pierre Poilievre manages to maintain some of those constituency level relationships and work while he's also juggling the duties of a leader. And I mean, maybe he'll be great at it. Maybe his staff will be great at it. That's totally possible. But that is one of those things that I'm sort of
It's a bit of
keeping
a
one
tough
eye
one,
on.
isn't it? Because
It
he's
is.
obviously busy with the rest of the country, you know. So it's a bit of a trade-off. You get, you know, wow, he's our MP.
Yeah.
But yeah, can I get my, you know, visa done or whatever it is, right? So yeah.
Yeah. When Bill's pension payment is late or something, he's
Yeah,
going to have to
yeah.
contact
You might
you.
have to
Follow
hire
up
an
kind of
extra
thing.
assistant or something,
There you
I'm
go.
thinking, you know. But I'm out of time here. Thanks so much, Tyler, for your time.
Oh, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Tyler Dawson, our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post. I'm Paul Arthur. On behalf of all of us at BCN, thanks for watching.